Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for today's presentation as part of the GreyLearning live webinar series. Very excited about today's presentation. We'll be focusing on the best photo tips I ever learned. More on that in just a moment, but first a couple of quick side notes. First off, for those of you who are not familiar with me, I'm Tim Gray. I know many of you are familiar with me from the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter that it continues to shock me to realize I've been publishing this email newsletter daily for over 20 years now. Just amazing. I actually did truly believe that at some point I would have answered all the questions and been finished, and that obviously was a foolish thought on my part. And I also publish a variety of video training courses for photographers. Many of you are signed up for my GreyLearning Ultimate Bundle, for example. And also we publish Pixology Magazine, which is a project I really enjoy participating in, creating, and I get a lot of great feedback about the magazine. The articles each month focused on Lightroom Classic, Photoshop, photography, and more. So thank you for all of you who read each monthly issue. If you're not already signed up, it is part of the GreyLearning Ultimate Bundle, but you can also get a standalone subscription. If you point your web browser here, timgray.me/Pixology, you can get all of the details. And today, talking about photo tips, making your photography better, improving your photography. Once you've got some great photos, of course, you're going to keep them organized. And I have a great online workshop, live online workshop experience during the month of March. 6 sessions, about 2 hours each, so 12 hours of live online instruction. And most importantly, the opportunity to get all of your specific questions answered, both during the live sessions as well as follow-up email. You can point your web browser at timgray.me/organize22 for all of the details, including a reduced price for a limited time. But without further ado, let's dive into the best photo tips I ever learned, which, as I was putting this presentation together, I started to realize, what was I thinking? No pressure, right? Because I was trying to put together some of my favorite tips that I've learned, and especially thinking back about some of the little nuggets of wisdom that I've gotten from other photographers in particular, and how I've implemented, or in some cases maybe not so much implemented, those into my own photography and workflow. And so I know that as soon as we're finished with this presentation, I'll bet I'll think of a couple of other best tips that I forgot. So we'll maybe have some follow-up related to tips. And certainly in the comments, I welcome your own thoughts as far as some of the best tips that you have learned over the years in your photography. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. And first, starting with a tip that I'm sure many of you are already very, very familiar with, a concept essentially that a lot of photographers talk about, I would say, and that is that the best camera is the one that you actually have with you. And the basic premise here, the basic idea is that first and foremost, we are photographers. And yes, that relates to a lot of gear, but perhaps more importantly is that photography relates to capturing images. And it's sort of funny to me because I'll often see photographers, scoff at somebody using a cheaper camera, using their smartphone as a camera, for example. And then I think back to my early days in photography where I was using black and white film, so I didn't even have color in my photos. Or earlier than that, some of the cameras that didn't have automatic exposure or automatic focus, you had to work a little bit harder for your photos, lower resolution digital cameras. Going back even, to wet plate photography or pinhole photography, photographers were still creating incredible images, and it didn't necessarily need to have, at least by today's standards, the top gear. As long as you can create an image, you can do something interesting. And in fact, as I had kind of been contemplating this notion, this concept a little bit, I had a trip recently, and I wrote about this in the latest issue of Pixology Magazine, by the way. And I decided that I was not going to bring a quote-unquote real camera with me, and instead I was only going to use my smartphone. I have an iPhone, and I would bring that as my only camera for this trip. I had been hired to teach on a cruise ship for 2 months, and going from Florida all the way into the Mediterranean across the Atlantic Ocean, so a variety of different scenes and opportunities along the way, and I thought it would be a fun experiment. However, the cruise line ran out of money, and after about 2 weeks instead of 2 months, the cruise came to an end, so I didn't get very much opportunity for photography. The experiment was over, but I did have a couple of stops along the way that I was able to photograph in. This is a scene from Puerto Limon in Costa Rica, on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, a town that's got lots of color and interesting elements here. And so, experimenting around, playing around with the notion of just using whatever camera was available. It was the best camera I had on that trip because it was the only. Here's another shot taken once again with that iPhone using the wide-angle lens in this case, and capturing a scene straight up in a park also in Puerto Limon, Costa Rica. Now, of course, I would say that in a way I've always been a photographer, but I really got my start in photography when I signed up for an elective class, a photography class in high school. That's when I really started to appreciate photography as an art form versus just documenting my experiences as, a kid growing up in Southern California, going to Disneyland with my camera and whatnot. And so the first of my many lessons in photography started during that high school photography teacher, a great teacher that I had, Mrs. B. And at one point along the way, she said to me, "Why don't you take this really high ISO film?" I can't remember, I think it was 1600 or 3200 ISO film, and go see what you can do with it. It's very sensitive to light, and so you'll be able to capture scenes that you might otherwise miss out on. And so I did. I went out to the beach and at sunrise and captured some early morning light shots and was impressed by how much light I could gather with this very sensitive film. The film, of course, was really grainy, so it almost looked like you had developed it, in a pile of sand. But I realized at some point along the way that bit of advice wasn't really truly about using high ISO film. In other words, my photography teacher wasn't trying to convince me that I should do high ISO photography. Rather, she was encouraging me to do something different. And so the lesson wasn't really use high ISO film. It was essentially don't be a creature of habit. And so don't always go for the standard viewpoint. Here, the World Trade Center in New York City, for example, looking straight up from the bottom of it, from the base of it, rather than a view from off in a distance, seeing the whole building. And, to experiment in your photography, to play around a little bit. This is a shot in Venice, Italy. I've talked about this photo before in the context of it's not an image that conveys Venice, and yet it's one of the favorite photos that I've ever captured in Venice, Italy, because it just looks better than most of my other photos. I'm not sure what that says about my other images from Venice, but the photos that just kind of show you what it looks like to be in Venice, for example, to me, it's not necessarily quite as interesting. I still want those photos, but I want to experiment around with, not the normal approach, going beyond the normal approach to photography, trying new things, and also going beyond your comfort zone, photographing the types of subjects that you don't normally capture. And for me personally, that happens to be photographing people. I often describe my photography as everything except people. I don't do wedding photography or portrait photography. And I've always sort of felt like that's just not what I'm comfortable with in terms of photography. Why, I don't know, because I'm comfortable with just about any other type of photography, but somehow people photography hasn't resonated with me. And so recently I started trying to, when travel opportunities created an opportunity to photograph somebody interesting or unique or in a great setting, in a great landscape, that I would take advantage of those opportunities. And this is in Madagascar, by the way. And so, trying to just go beyond the basics. If you're a landscape photographer, get out there and try something new. Do some macro photography or some people photography or some event photography. And if you're a portrait photographer, get out there and try to capture some landscapes. You kind of push your boundaries a little bit, both in the context of the type of photography that you normally do, as well as the type of photography you might find yourself avoiding because you're just not comfortable with it. Another great piece of advice I got early on, and in a couple of different interesting ways. So this image here, this is actually a scan from a slide in my early days in color photography. So after I'd graduated high school, and then I ended up getting a job with nature photographer George Lepp, who was a columnist for Outdoor Photographer magazine. I'm sure many of you know of his work. And so I had the pleasure, the privilege of working for George for about 5 years and got great advice along the way. And so I would share my photos with him from time to time, go out and capture some images. And I thought I had done so great. And this is one I showed him, and he said, "Yeah, but you need everything in focus. You've got to get everything in focus in your photos." And that's certainly true to some extent, right? And George is primarily, I would say, a nature photographer, landscape photography, nature photography, to some extent, bird and animal photography, wildlife photography. And so from his sort of focus, if you will, on landscape or nature photography, that advice totally makes sense, because for a typical landscape shot, you very often do want to have the entire scene in focus. The funny thing is, though, with this image, I kind of felt like, yeah, but I like the narrow depth of field. And so, I sort of, even though I took the advice in stride, in my mind, I was thinking, yeah, but I still want to use narrow depth of field. Not always. There's situations such as this waterfall in Austria where having a lot of depth of field or enough depth of field for the scene makes perfect sense. But there are other situations where you don't want a lot of depth of field. Here, I wanted the background to be blurred. You could see there's a lot of texture in the background, and that would have competed with my subject here. And so I wanted to narrow up the depth of field just a little bit. Now, if you read the recent issue of Pixology magazine, then you'll know that this image also frustrated me. The upper portion of the leaf here actually is not in focus, and so I wished in this shot that I had a little bit more depth of field. So in the context of the actual subject here, George was absolutely right. I need everything in focus for the area that I want in focus. The background here I wanted blurred, but I needed a little bit more depth of field for the leaf. That's actually something that has always frustrated me about this photo, because I really like this photo, but it's always driven me a little bit crazy that I didn't have quite enough depth of field for that leaf. I did put this, though, on the cover of the February issue of Pixology magazine, and got a lot of good feedback from folks who thought it was a good photo. So thank you for all of you who appreciated the photo and let me know that. And again, just to emphasize that there are situations where I really like narrow depth of field, even when it gets criticized by others. So here, for example, this is from a handful of years ago out in the Palouse region of eastern Washington state. And I've been leading photo workshops out in the Palouse for more than 10 years now. And so I've visited many of the same subjects more than a few times, including this great red barn. And so that helped to encourage me to start thinking more about, okay, what can I do differently here? What's a unique perspective on this barn? And of course, we've got a wheat field in the foreground, which is one of the primary crops out in the Palouse. And so I thought, let's have the wheat in the foreground. Normally, I might have everything in focus, as George had taught me, or I might have the barn in focus and the framing wheat in the foreground blurred by narrower depth of field. But I decided to go the opposite approach here and had the wheat in the foreground in focus, the barn obviously in the background out of focus. And I really liked the effect. It made the barn a little bit secondary to the wheat. But when I shared this image online, shortly after I had originally captured it, I had more than a few people essentially criticizing the image, saying that I should have had the barn in focus. I don't happen to agree. I understand the concept and I understand the motivation, but in this case, I personally prefer the image with the narrow depth of field. One of many variations on this subject, the red barn in this case, where I actually decided to make the barn secondary. So it was a great privilege working with George Lepp for a number of years early on in my career, and one of the additional privileges I had during that time was to meet a number of other photographers, a number of other great photographers, and one of those was DeWitt Jones. And so I met him very early on in my photographic career and had the privilege of getting to know him a little bit and seeing some of his presentations, sometimes more than one time, the same presentation, which was always good to get, always a little variation, little tidbits here and there. And one of the little nuggets that I really got and appreciated from DeWitt, who, if I didn't mention, by the way, is National Geographic photographer, now a motivational speaker as well. But one of his presentations was focused on the notion that there's more than one right answer. And he would talk about this photo assignment that he was doing, and he found the shot, but then he found another shot and another shot and another shot, and came away with some really great images from this photo shoot. And I thought it was such a valuable lesson in photography where sometimes you might be struggling to find a right answer and it's just not quite working. Sometimes you find the right answer and you're finished and you maybe neglect to move on. So for example, this photo is of canola, fields of canola, rolling hills of these yellow flowers out in the Palouse region of eastern Washington state during a photo workshop. And on these workshops, I'm always fascinated when a photographer gets out of the van that we travel around in, captures a photograph of the subject that we're visiting at the moment, and then gets in the van when they're finished and just patiently waits for everyone else to finish. And I'm always surprised by this because I feel like there's always more to do, right? There's always other angles to pursue, other possibilities. There's always more than one right answer. And so I'll just share a handful of photos here as examples that I've captured specifically of canola. Obviously, you could use many different examples, different contexts. In other words, it might be I visit a red barn, but then I also photograph the wheat. Then I also do macro shots of a ladybug. Then I also photograph the windmill over there and the tractor over there. And it's all these different subjects. So there's all sorts of different ways that we could illustrate this concept. I just am going to happen to illustrate with a single subject just to give you a little bit of the taste of some of the variety that I've sought out in terms of trying to find more than one right answer for a given subject or for a given scene that I might be photographing. So here, a wide view, as it were, filling the frame with the canola field, this dense, lush collection of yellow flowers, but then also working with the blue sky and the yellow flowers, those complementary colors, a little bit of a closer view, obviously. You've got the field in the background out of focus, and then some of the flowers in the foreground in focus, set against the blue sky. So again, those complementary colors, but I can also set the yellow flowers against a yellow background. And again, a relatively close-in view focused on the crop itself, or widening up again, especially when Mother Nature cooperates a little bit. So sometimes these additional right answers are sort of presented to you as gifts, essentially, where in this case, moderately windy day, scattered clouds across the sky, and the clouds are moving relatively quickly across the sky. And so I get so excited in this situation out in the Palouse, well, anywhere really, but especially somewhere with these rolling hills. When the clouds are moving fairly quickly, the shadows are going to move quickly across the landscape, and they'll just paint with light and shadow across the landscape and give you all sorts of different textures and patterns. So here's just one sample of that type of scenario, once again with the canola. Or when I get really close to focusing on an individual stalk, and then I've got the canola in the background getting a color wash out of focus, as well as additional canola in the foreground, slightly blocking the view of the stalk of canola that is my subject, so that I get an out of focus color wash in the foreground as well as the background. And this canola stalk just seems to be bathed in this glow of color, essentially. Or backing out again and including the sky, again, those complementary colors with the blue sky and the yellow canola in the foreground, rolling hills, intersecting, a little bit of light and shadow at play. Obviously a very wide angle field of view in this case. Or I mentioned, on a windy day, those clouds moving across the sky. Well, sometimes it gets so windy that it becomes a challenge to capture a sharp image of the canola just whipping around in the wind. And so, that's, I guess, a little bonus tip there is that sometimes when it doesn't feel like there's a right answer, so there's always more than one right answer, but sometimes it feels like what you're trying to accomplish is not possible under the circumstances. It's too windy to get a sharp image of canola, but you can also embrace that and find another right answer by way of a motion blur. So in this case, the canola whipping around in the wind, and so trying to just get a very low angle, so pointing the camera upward toward the sky and capturing a lot of photos, because with this type of an image, you never quite know how things are going to turn out. And so capturing a fairly large number of images at varying shutter speeds to see if I could find, and fortunately I did, an image that I was happy with. Another right answer, sort of making lemonade out of lemons, taking a challenging situation and turning it into a positive, and a victory, essentially, where it was going to be impossible to get, a photo like this on a windy day, for example. But if I just embrace that wind, let the canola move in the breeze and capture the resulting blur of the canola. And so part of that, the seeking out more than one right answer photographically, involves trying to make sure that you're focusing on looking for additional right answers. And sometimes it's a matter of trying to make the most of a challenging situation. It's raining, and so it's not the most beautiful scene in front of you, but now that you're going to get reflections and puddles, so just trying to find the most opportunities possible with a given subject and to force yourself to sort of think creatively, and especially when it's a challenging circumstance, when you didn't get the conditions you were hoping for. I think that in particular is a great opportunity to grow as a photographer, to improve your perspective as a photographer. But even when you think you've got the right shot, keep looking. It's sort of just like exercising a muscle, exercising your creativity, exercising your photographic composition and creativity, I think is very, very important. So even you've got the shot you need, you've got the winning shot, now you're looking for other right answers. They might not be as good as the first right answer, so to speak, but that practice of exercising your creativity, looking for other solutions, other photographic answers, I think is tremendously valuable in improving your craft as a photographer. Another early piece of advice that I heard so often early on was to use a tripod, and especially, you can imagine, I'm sure some of you had this experience, if you also got your start in photography with a high school photography class. When I went to the camera store to buy a tripod because I was learning that this was a necessary piece of equipment, I was on a high school student's budget. I wasn't going to spend hundreds of dollars on a tripod, so I probably just got the cheapest tripod I could find. It wasn't even a ball head. It was one of these where you've got individual knobs for panning and tilting and all the different angles of motion. And so it would take some time to get things set up. And so there was, this sort of negative experience I had early on where the tripod seemed like so much more trouble than it was worth. And so I would always, kind of take this advice, with a grain of salt, you might say. And as, of course, I got further along into my photography, then getting a good tripod with a ball head so that I had greater flexibility, or using, a gimbal, something like a Wimberley mount if, photographing birds in flight or something like that. And so I certainly appreciate the value of using a tripod, and I certainly respect photographers who actually use a tripod. In fact, I've had on my photo workshops photographers who literally use a tripod for every single photo they capture. It might take them a little bit longer, but they're also probably getting a higher percentage of sharp images. But my personal approach, which is not the right answer necessarily, it's what works for me, but my personal approach is to use a tripod when it's needed. And so with a longer exposure, I believe this was something like 1/4 of a second, which I suppose I could have handheld, but didn't take the chance. But with a longer exposure, or even the preceding image, this is just before sunrise out in the Alps of Bavaria in southern Germany, just across the border from Austria. And it's going to be a moderately long exposure just by virtue of there's not a lot of light yet, and I might want to allow for a longer exposure to get a little bit smoother surface on the water there, a little bit of a longer exposure here as well. And so my view is when it's necessary, I absolutely am going to use a tripod, and I don't like to chance it. If I think it's necessary, then it's necessary, and I'll make use of a tripod. But I also find that very often a tripod is not necessary. As long as I can get an adequately fast shutter speed, then I don't feel the need to use a tripod. If I can get a sharp image handheld, my preference is to shoot handheld. And part of that relates to just greater flexibility. And I think this image from Easter Island is actually a really good example of that, because as fascinating as Easter Island is, it can feel a little bit frustrating to try to get a unique photo, in part because you're visiting spots, you're standing in the same spot as so many photographers have stood before you. And so there's only so many ways that you can necessarily interpret the scene, or at least it feels that way. And there's also, for lack of a better description, there's kind of a lot of clutter. And so you see, obviously, the Moai statue on the far right was sort of my key subject, my anchor. and I wanted these other statues, but I had to get them lined up in a way that there weren't awkward intersections, for example. And if I had used a tripod, I know it would have been a very frustrating experience because I would have, gotten set up. I need to move a little to the left. No, that was too far. Back to the right. And I need to get a little bit higher, down a little bit lower, rotate this way, drift that way, And it would take a lot longer to get the shot, and that would prove frustrating. And so, my personal approach is not necessarily what I recommend, but it is the approach that I take, if we're being honest here, and that is I like the flexibility of shooting handheld when the circumstances warrant it, when I can get sharp images, when I can get adequately fast shutter speeds, for example, for the situation, shooting handheld. But of course, I will not hesitate, and I'll be quick to use a tripod in situations where it is essentially necessary or at least advisable, so that I'm making sure that I'm getting a sharp image and the most stable platform for the camera. So I feel that I can be a pretty stable platform without the tripod most of the time, but whenever that's in doubt, then of course I'm going to make use of the tripod. Early on, once again, in my photography, I was taught essentially the importance of learning to estimate exposure. It wasn't right away that I actually took that lesson to heart, in part because I was fortunate to have grown up with cameras that already had exposure meters available to them. And so, I wasn't forced to manually estimate exposure, etc. But the advice was always to learn to estimate exposure, know what the settings are going to be ahead of time. And again, at first I thought this wasn't the best advice in the world, because I could always just capture an image and review. I could always use the camera's meter. But of course, it wasn't too long in those early days of film photography where, and especially when I transitioned to color slide film as opposed to black and white film, color slide film having much less exposure latitude, I started to realize that I was making mistakes. And first and foremost, I started to learn that the meter is not always right, that you can't always trust the meter. You need to sort of outthink or outsmart your camera's meter. You need to understand how the meter is working. Are you using spot metering versus evaluative metering, for example? So what metering mode are you using? What within the scene are you actually metering off of? And how is the camera processing that information to give you a recommendation when it comes to the exposure for the scene? And so as I started having, I won't say how many frames, but every now and then, an exposure that didn't work out, an exposure that was way off. You get your slide film developed and see that it's just a clear slide with nothing to it, and realize, wow, something went wrong there, and I guess it was probably me. Or me trusting the camera when I shouldn't necessarily have done so, the camera's meter. And so, there's some real basic rules of thumb that you can use, or just, sort of study your camera settings and get a sense, see when you're needing to use exposure compensation. And so one of the classic rules I'm sure most of you are familiar with is Sunny 16, that on a sunny day, assuming a clear day, where we've got full sunlight, if you set your lens aperture to f16, then you can set your shutter speed to quote-unquote match the ISO setting. Obviously, the shutter speed's actually a fraction, but let's say you're at ISO 400. That means you'd use a 400th of a second shutter speed, or the closest matching shutter speed, at f16 on a sunny day. At 100 ISO, it'd be 100th of a second, etc. And that at least provides a pretty good starting point. And I found over the years that it can be really helpful to at least have that, even if I'm using an automatic exposure mode or aperture priority, for example, to have a sense of what should be a good setting, and to get some idea of when I think the camera's meter might be getting tricked a little bit. Or to learn various rules of sort of compensating for exposure. So here, for example, the white snow and a mostly white church here, the essentially white of the overcast sky up above. And so this is, in some respects, sort of that classic view of snow. We can meter off snow, and especially on a sunny day, add about 2 stops. In this case, with overcast skies, probably more like 1 stop, meaning I don't want to get that pure, bright, sunny white. But again, metering off snow plus 2 stops in sunny conditions is another very standard estimate a rule for estimating the exposure settings that might work, or compensating for exposure settings to make sure that you're getting a better result. And another one that I have especially come to appreciate relates to blue hour, because I really enjoy photographing whenever possible during blue hour. And there's a rule. I find a lot of photographers aren't familiar with this rule, again, just depending on the metering and hoping it works out well. But blue hour 8 and 8. So f8 and 8 seconds at 100 ISO. You can probably see in this image, I've stopped down, I believe this was to f16 to get the nice, well, I like anyway, the starburst effect for some of those lights within the scene. And in this case, I didn't want to go too long on my exposure, even though, yes, of course, with an 8-second exposure, I was using a tripod. But the viewpoint here, this is Florence, Italy, the Duomo, viewed from Piazzale Michelangelo, which is a very popular, for good reason, tourist spot, including big, heavy tourist buses rolling in. And so I wanted to shorten that exposure a little bit, hoping to minimize the risk of vibration from those buses. And so I raised the ISO by 2 stops rather than speeding up the shutter speed, or rather, or I should say, rather than extending that shutter speed to even longer. But again, f8, 8 seconds at 100 ISO. But as with all of these exposure estimates, you can always fine tune, right? So I could stop down to f16 and then raise the ISO to, for example, 400 ISO, compensating one setting for the other to maintain an even exposure. And of course, we can use tools for this to make it a little bit easier if there's a big disparity, big difference between the different settings you're using, including an exposure tool within the PhotoPills app that I'll mention just a little bit later. But the point is, all these sort of rules of thumb are just a way for you to help kind of get a sense of what you think you might need, and in terms of the exposure. And then, of course, you can always calculate your way to different settings, which actually is a little bit of a bonus aside. Reminds me of a similar little bit of advice. John Shaw, another great nature photographer, would talk about being able to size up which lens. He knew if he stood before a scene what focal length lens he was going to need. I don't think I'm quite to that level in terms of being able to estimate what focal length I'll need. Of course, nowadays that is becoming increasingly challenging with different sensor sizes, full frame versus a crop sensor, for example. But the point is, the more that you can kind of anticipate which lens to get out of the bag, which camera settings to start with, etc., the quicker you're going to be able to take advantage of the situation in front of you and be sure to capture a great photo. Now, one of the things I've sort of noticed about myself over the years, if you will, is that I have a bit of attention to detail, and perhaps more to the point, I really notice distractions relatively quickly. Some of that's just natural, some of that is learned. And so going back to my early days in my photography career working for George Lepp, one of the things that he liked to do very often was capture composite panoramas. This image, by the way, happens to not be a composite panorama. It is a panorama captured with a smartphone, with an iPhone. This is the Forum in Rome, Italy, and so just panning across the scene. But obviously, many photographers capture composite panoramas, where you capture a frame over to the far left, for example, pan over to the right, overlapping a bit depending on the focal length lens that you're using, somewhere in the 20 to 50% of overlap range, and then continue capturing additional frames all the way across and assemble those later in the computer. And so George became very well known for his composite panoramas, and the office where I worked was in his home, and so he would hang, of course, some of his favorite panoramas around the house, around the office, and every now and then I would notice a little flaw. This is in the early days, with using Photoshop and layer masks, and it was rather detailed work, required a lot of focus, and you're bound to miss something every now and then, and there would be a little bit of a flaw where 2 frames had overlapped and the mask in Photoshop hadn't been done perfectly. And so I'm sure it would drive George crazy, but I felt that I needed to let him know if there was a print that had a little flaw in it that he needed to correct it. Of course, I didn't get a chance to see in many cases until it was already printed and framed, matted and framed and hung on the wall. But I started to appreciate the importance of those blemishes and spotting. And so now if I go see photography in an art gallery, for example, or museum, if there's any flaws, if there's chromatic aberrations, or if the photographer neglected to crop a distraction out of the edge of the frame, any of these sort of visual blemishes, the things that you wish weren't there and maybe didn't notice at the time. And so, for example, this is the Oculus at the World Trade Center site. It's the Port Authority Trans-Hudson train terminal or subway terminals here and whatnot. A really interesting building to photograph both inside and out. But I noticed after I captured this image that there were some flaws. So here's a dust spot up at the top right corner of the image. And then down below it on this beam, there's maybe that's a bolt or just something that got stuck there and something running down off of it. I'm not even sure. But to me, those are visual blemishes. And, there's always a little bit of a challenge, I think, in deciding what to clean up out of your photos and what not to. It's up to each photographer to decide for themselves. I personally usually take the approach of I'm just trying to be honest with the viewer. So I'm not trying to create a fake scene, but if there were distractions that I could have gotten rid of if the opportunity existed, those I feel okay removing. And so these sorts of blemishes, so if you just watch these blemishes up here at the top right, going to the next frame, and you see they magically disappear. So there's the blemishes versus without. And one of the challenges that I find with blemishes in a photo is that once you see it, you can't stop looking at it. You can't unsee it. And so here's another example, a photograph that I captured in Alaska of a bald eagle, and I was so happy with this image until I noticed that gull down at the bottom center of the frame. Fortunately, thanks to the magic of Photoshop, that gull can be magically erased from the frame. But if I didn't remove that, this image, well, it certainly would not win any awards, would not win any prizes, but more importantly, in my view, it would really frustrate me to know that that goal was there. I would have, captured a split second sooner to not have the goal in the frame, for example, had I been able to anticipate that. I feel no qualms about removing an object such as that, a distracting element. So as much as possible, I encourage photographers, and I certainly try myself as a photographer, to avoid those distractions in the first place, to find an angle where the distraction isn't there, or to time your shot carefully, to keep your sensor clean, as we saw with the shot of the Oculus where I had a dust spot there. But when it's not possible, then I still think it makes sense, whether it means cropping the image to get rid of a distraction around the edge or doing a little bit of image cleanup work. Obviously, depending on the context, if we're talking journalism or entering a photo into a photo contest, sometimes that type of image cleanup is not allowed. So we have to be cognizant of those considerations. But when it's your own photography being presented for your own purposes, then you get to make that decision. And in my view, it's clean up those blemishes. We don't want to have visual blemishes in the photos. Another lesson that I learned, and I first learned this when I was getting familiar with panning in photography. I suppose I maybe had learned this more when I was taking tennis lessons as a kid or learning golf, and that is to follow through. When you're swinging a bat, or maybe I learned it in t-ball before I even played tennis. So any of these sports where you're swinging a club or a tennis racket or a bat, and you'll get the advice to follow through. You don't just hit the ball and stop, right? You continue as though you're following with the ball. And so I learned that same concept when it comes to panning with a subject, getting a motion blur, to follow through. Don't just capture the image and freeze the camera. Stop moving the camera. You start panning with the subject before you capture the photo. You capture the photo and you keep panning with them, possibly capturing additional photos along the way. But that panning helps ensure that you have a smoother photo that you're capturing, that you're panning with the subject more smoothly, getting a better result. But that follow-through is not always just literally following through with the subject as you're panning. Sometimes that follow-through is really more about following through on a concept. So some of you, I'm sure, have heard this story before. This was quite a while ago, and I was at the Ding Darling Wildlife Refuge, I believe it is, in Florida, and very early morning, and photographing these snowy egrets, and they were off in this shadowy area feeding. And so it was very frustrating that, they were in this little dark corner, but the activity was really interesting. And by the time they left that area, if they would catch, a fish or shrimp or something and fly away, then it became just a shot, just a flight photo, and I was less interested in that. I was trying to get these sort of action shots, you might say. But the angle wasn't right. The behavior of the birds it essentially wasn't cooperating with what I was after myself, what I was looking for. And so it got a little bit frustrating until I realized, as the sunrise started transitioning into some really nice kind of purplish, pinkish color, that if I just followed through, both literally and figuratively, so following through beyond my original concept in terms of the photo that I wanted of the birds feeding in this little shadowed nook, sort of changing the concept, you might say, and then following through literally with the movement of the bird. And so as these snowy egrets would continue flying across the scene here, further over to my left, they crossed over into the path of the sun that was starting to get some nice color thanks to some clouds, and I got a completely different photo from what I was looking for, but it's a photo that's way better than what I could have hoped to accomplish, in my view, with what I was actually trying to accomplish. And so I went beyond what I thought I wanted to photograph, thankfully, and came away with a photograph that I liked quite a bit better. Another little bit of advice, and this one, I kind of gleaned together from several different scenarios, but at some point I kind of realized that a lot of my compositions, a lot of my photos, the subjects that I was photographing were sort of happy accidents. I would go just wander around a city or location and see what I could see. And sometimes that worked out nicely. This is Bethesda Terrace, for example, in Central Park in New York City. As a bonus lesson, this is a spot where a lot of tourists gather. And so getting a shot like this with no people in it calls for considerable patience. This is a good example of compose and wait. Compose your scene the way you want it and wait until the subject that you don't want leaves the frame, or the subject that you do want enters the frame. And in this case, get there fairly early in the morning as well, so that there aren't quite as many tourists out and about. And wait and wait and wait until you've got that moment that probably won't last very long, where, in this case, for me personally, wanting no people in the frame, you might want the opposite. Wait till there's just the right person in a red dress or what have you going through the frame, or whatever the case might be. But again, I was finding that many of the photos that I was capturing when I was traveling, etc., that they were sort of just happy accidents. And so this came together when another photographer invited me to join a photo shoot of the Manhattan skyline. He was doing a little photo workshop and invited me to come along. And so I went over to Weehawken, New Jersey for this little photo workshop, and the Manhattan skyline, I thought, wow, I wish I had known about this view when I first visited, really, New York City. I would have gone and photographed it for sure. And so that was one of the moments where that lesson really kind of struck home for me. And so I realized, the importance of seeking out, again, in the concept of New York City, Manhattan skyline viewed from Brooklyn with the Brooklyn Bridge in the foreground, kind of a classic scene. But you've got to seek it out. You've got to know that this scene exists. This is a fairly well-known one. And so, whenever I visit a location now, for the first time in particular, I try to make a point of researching, okay, what are the photographic opportunities that exist and that I want to seek out? But going beyond that, I've shared the story. This is a photo from Hallstatt in the Alps of Austria. And I've shared the story about this in terms of kind of getting frustrated that I wasn't finding a good view that showed what this town was like, perched on the side of the lake at the foot of the Alps, the mountains seeming to go straight up and the lake in front, until I realized that I could rent a little electric boat and get out onto the lake and capture an image. So both you're kind of finding the right spots in general, more on that shortly, but then also kind of working the scene a little bit to find the right perspective for the subject, which takes me back to another lesson that I learned very early on, very relatively early on in my photography. This goes back to 2005, as it turned out, and I was invited to teach Photoshop, actually, during a photo workshop in Maine, in Sebasco, Maine. And I was not much of a photographer at the time, I'll say. And so this is just a scene that I captured nearby during late afternoon light. But the actual photo workshop was being led by Sam Abel, a photographer for National Geographic, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And so I got to sit in on his workshop sessions with these students, and then I would just teach a little bit of Photoshop here and there and assist. And one of the lessons that resonated, I'm not sure these are the words he used because it's been a while and my memory's not that great, but this notion of macro versus micro composition, I'm sure he probably used different words to describe this, but the way he would explain it is that photographers in general are pretty good about kind of the big picture. That they spot a subject that they like and they can appreciate a scene that's worthy of being photographed, but then they struggle a little bit with the smaller details of that composition. And this is one that I valued the lesson when I first learned it, and it's become actually more valuable to me over time. I mentioned that I wasn't a great photographer back then, or at least I've gotten better since then. I found something, so I guess this is sort of the macro side of it, is I found a scene that was interesting. So these leaves against the dark water, murky water, but some interesting colors. But I didn't find a good composition, or I didn't consider turning over the leaves so they would all be, front side out or what have you. But another example that I've used more recently in my photography, finding a cool subject. So this is a lone tree out in the Palouse region of eastern Washington state, and that's interesting all by itself, but this isn't the best angle for this subject, and it's not the best timing in terms of the crop that's out in front of it. I believe these were garbanzo beans versus a wheat field. But another year and a different angle, finding wheat to put in the foreground and an angle that I felt worked a little bit better. So kind of taking that view, the subject or the scene that I thought was worthy of photographing, and then trying to find the optimal angle to get higher or lower, or move to the left or the right, closer, further away, different lens, different camera settings, whatever the case might be. But don't just stop with your first instinct, so to speak. Really work that scene and try to find the best example. Another example that I've shared a number of times, because it's one of my biggest pet peeves from when I lived in the Seattle area. I'm sure some of you have seen this example before. This is a classic view of downtown Seattle with the Space Needle, Mount Rainier off in the distance. And this is the scene as I see it most of the time when I see postcards and whatnot, where the Space Needle intersects or overlaps with the Columbia Tower in the background. If you move over to the right just a little bit, then that Space Needle gets out into the clear. And so again, working the scene from kind of a big perspective, but then fine-tuning the scene from a smaller perspective. A great lesson that I learned quite a while ago from photographer Sam Abel. And then I've also learned over the years that it can be so helpful to create opportunities. When I would speak at photography events, very often they would have breakout sessions for photographers here at Florida's Birding and Photo Fest in St. Augustine, Florida, for example, a sunrise photo opportunity with some horses. Some locals would bring their horses out and run through the water or pose at sunrise, or same concept on the Central Coast of California, getting subjects, planning ahead, scheduling to have horseback riders come to the beach at sunrise or at sunset so that you could photograph them set against silhouette against a beautiful sunset, for example. So actually kind of creating some photo opportunities. This would be akin to environmental portraits or just portrait photography in general, for example. You find a model and make a plan to photograph them in a particular way. Or creating plans. I've talked about the PhotoPills app. I'll mention it again a little bit later here. But realizing when there's going to be a full moon, and that the full moon is going to rise or set around sunset or sunrise. And so you can create, so here, for example, sunrise in the Palouse with a red barn, and the full moon getting ready to set off in the background. So knowing when there's going to be a full moon, and even being able to plan for the vantage point. Also out in the Palouse, coordinating with crop dusters, I would get excited anytime we'd find a crop duster out spraying a field. But of course, as soon as you show up, they're going to leave. And so if you actually get to know the crop dusters and coordinate with them so that you can plan to safely be in the area, upwind from them, for example, hopefully with the sun at your back, and from a safe vantage point so you can photograph the crop duster working the field, spraying the fields, in this case from an elevated vantage point, but with a crop duster who's become a friend, so that it's very easy to coordinate and plan ahead to create an opportunity to photograph them hopefully in a circumstance where the landscape cooperates as well. So here we've got a hill that's set as a backdrop for the crop duster, but again, just trying to create those opportunities wherever you can. And then also travel, and this is a tip I've certainly shared and I've certainly been enthusiastic about over the years. And especially, the pandemic has really brought this point home for me, because I've been very fortunate to have a variety of opportunities to travel for photo workshops. I've had opportunities to teach on board a cruise ship, which has taken me to a variety of locations around the world, speaking at events in different locations. Really just tremendous opportunities to visit a number of locations all around the world. But interestingly enough, my travel actually kind of started late. I noticed here, by the way, Iceland is missing from my map just because when I went to Iceland, my camera didn't have GPS built in. so my map's not complete in terms of those earlier photos, but I really appreciate how new experiences can make you a better photographer. As I mentioned, I got my start fairly late in terms of international travel, at least. My first visit to Europe was not until 2004, when I was hired to speak at the time, huge Photokina event in Cologne, Germany. And so I was initially just traveling to speak at events and started to realize just how much I appreciated photography. Then I got an email. Somebody asked if I could come to South Africa and be a keynote speaker at their photography event for a group of camera clubs in South Africa. And I was living in Seattle at the time, so I was reluctant to travel so far. They wanted me to speak essentially for a day and a half, and to go from Seattle, the flight was Seattle to Amsterdam, which is about 12 hours, then to Johannesburg, which is about 12 hours, and then about a 6-hour drive to Machubiskloof, and very close to the Zimbabwe border. And it just sounded like an awful lot of travel for speaking for a day and a half. As much as, I was already a fan of traveling at the time, they said, well, can you stay for a few extra days? We'll take you on safari. Yes, I can. And had an amazing experience on safari in South Africa for a few days. And so I really have gotten to appreciate the value of travel. And obviously, for me personally, a lot of my photography has sort of become travel photography. But regardless of what type of photography you personally prefer, that you personally focus on, I think travel broadens your horizons, broadens your experience, and makes you a better photographer. It helps you to better appreciate the world we live in. So, for example, when I was teaching on board a cruise ship that was visiting the peninsula of Antarctica, looking out the window and seeing an iceberg, a huge iceberg, it was just an absolutely incredible experience. And so appreciating the world that we live in, appreciating the interactions with people along the way. So even just a glance at the interaction, especially when there's no language, you don't share a common language to communicate, and it's just gestures and smiles. This happens to be in the island nation of Kiribati, out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, by the way. Or beautiful sights that inspire us to photograph. This was during a photo workshop in Austria, where actually I had seen the rowboat with the fishermen and didn't really think too much of it. And one of the workshop participants asked if we could stop, and I said, sure, why not? But we have to make it quick because we want to get over to this other scene that I had in mind. And I was so glad we stopped, because it really worked out with the backlighting of the sun, and the steam fog worked out to be a beautiful, beautiful scene. And it's these sorts of kind of magical moments that really can inspire you in photography. Or just beautiful landscapes. This happens to be a peak on the island of Moorea in French Polynesia, not too far from Tahiti. And just a staggeringly beautiful landscape that I was really eager to photograph as a result, and get out there and try to find some vantage points moving around the island, and getting up to some of the higher elevations in particular, for example, and seeing what sorts of scenes that I could photograph. So a wide variety of benefits to travel, just kind of getting outside of your normal scenery, finding new subjects, new scenes to photograph, and finding inspiration in your photography as well. And then finally, I think one of the lessons that I've learned, especially because I teach in the world of photography, is the value of continuing to learn. In many respects, the only way that I'm able to really continue teaching in photography is if I continue learning in photography, whether it's camera gear or software, computers, hardware, technology, etc. And I've learned that the journey in photography is really never finished. I started learning really most significantly in high school, and I was working with George Lepp and getting exposed to other photographers and meeting photographers at events and at workshops, and always getting these little nuggets of knowledge and wisdom from other photographers. And so I continue. I'm always trying to push my skills, push my limits in photography, to be a better photographer, to be a more creative photographer, more knowledgeable photographer, more organized photographer. And, I've realized as well that, my favorite photos now, in my view, are way better than my favorite photos from 10 or 20 years ago. At least I hope so. And so seeking out those opportunities to improve my skills as a photographer in every aspect of photography. And I mentioned, by the way, photo pills. Here's a full moon rising over the heart of Rome that was made possible by some planning for the position and timing of the full moon. And so that is something that's covered, by the way. I know many of you already have access to my photo planning with photo pills course. So photo pills is a smartphone app that I find tremendously valuable for planning various aspects of photography. And so you can learn how to use it by following this link, timgrey.me/pills19, and that will cause a discount to be included automatically as well. All right, so I do want to thank you all for joining me for this presentation as part of the GreyLearning Live webinar series. If there are any questions, feel free to post those in the chat. I'll try to get to some of those now if possible, or I can follow up in an Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. I should mention, by the way, if you're not already getting the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, you can visit asktimgray.com and sign up for that daily email newsletter. And in the meantime, hopefully today's presentation has helped inspire you to capture better photos. But once you've got those photos, you're going to want to get them organized. We do still have some space available for my upcoming online workshop. This will be during the month of March, a couple of weeks in March, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 2 weeks, 2-hour sessions. So a total of 6 sessions, 12 hours of live online instruction where you can get your questions answered, and where I'll, of course, teach you what I feel is everything you need to know about organizing your photos in Lightroom Classic. And you can sign up for just $99. And that does ensure that you'll get the opportunity to submit and get answers to your questions during the live sessions. Those live sessions are recorded, so you've got ongoing access to the recordings. And of course, if you've come up with a question after the fact, you're able to send a follow-up question via email as well. All right, so thank you all once again for joining me, and I'll hope to see you again live online as part of another presentation as part of the GreyLearning Live webinar series. I'll hope to have you all signed up for Ask Tim Gray, the email newsletter, so that you can keep up with the questions and the answers that go out each weekday morning. So thank you all once again, and we'll talk to you again very soon.